Before Queen existed, Freddie slept on Brian May's floor for 3 weeks because he could not afford rent. He never told anyone until the night he was dying. Close your eyes. It is 1970. London is cold in the specific way London is cold in February, not dramatic, just unrelenting. You are 23 years old. You do not have a name yet that means anything to anyone. You do not have a band that has been heard outside a handful of rooms in West London. You have a guitar, a few clothes, and an envelope with not enough money in it to cover next week's rent. You are Freddie Not yet Mercury, not yet anyone. And you are standing outside a flat shared by a physics student named Brian May, holding a rolled-up sleeping bag, trying to find the words for the sentence you are about to say. You say it anyway. Can I stay here for a bit? Brian May says yes, without asking why. Without asking for how long. Without asking the obvious question about money. You sleep on his floor that night. You sleep on it the next night. You sleep on it for 3 weeks. Now open your eyes. 21 years later, in a bedroom in Kensington, dying, Freddie Mercury will finally tell Brian May what those 3 weeks actually felt like from the inside. He never told him at the time. He never told anyone. The winter of 1970 was not kind to anyone trying to make a living from music in London, and it was particularly unkind to a 23-year-old art school graduate named Farrokh Bulsara, who had not yet settled on the name Freddie Mercury, and had certainly not yet found the band that would make that name mean something to the entire world. He had a job, intermittently a stall in Kensington Market, selling clothes, occasional illustration work, the scattered income of someone trying to stay close enough to art and music to keep believing in both. What he did not have in the early weeks of that year was anywhere reliable to sleep. His flat had fallen through the details of exactly how have never been recorded in any account that survives. Only the fact of it. The abrupt and humiliating math of rent due and money not arriving in time to cover it. He had a few friends from Ealing Art College. He had, increasingly, a musician named Brian May, whom he had met through Roger Taylor, and with whom he had begun the early, exploratory conversations that would eventually become a band.It. It was Brian May's floor he ended up on. Freddie did not ask Brian for money. He did not ask for a loan or an advance or any of the practical solutions that would have addressed the actual problem more directly than sleeping on someone's floor. He asked for a place to sleep, phrased as casually as he could manage, as though it were a minor inconvenience rather than the specific humiliation of a grown man with nowhere else to go. This was already, at 23, recognizably Freddie the instinct to manage the presentation of a problem even while the problem itself remained completely unsolved. He would spend the rest of his life doing versions of this, managing the visible shape of difficulty while keeping its actual weight private, asking for the smallest possible favor that would technically solve the immediate crisis, while never naming the crisis itself out loud. Brian May, for his part, did not push. He said yes. He did not ask why Freddie's flat had fallen through, or how long it might take to sort out, or whether there was anything more permanent he should be helping arrange. He simply made room on the floor. He simply made room on the floor. 3 weeks is a long time to sleep on someone else's floor, while pretending every single morning that this is a temporary and minor situation rather than the specific evidence of having nothing else. Freddie would have woken early, most days, before Brian needed the room for anything, rolling the sleeping bag tightly, stacking it in a corner, making the space look as though it had not been slept in, the way a person does when they want their presence to take up as little room as possible. He would have gone out during the days, to the market stall, to whatever rehearsals or conversations were slowly assembling the outline of a band, returning each evening to the same floor, the same careful unrolling, the same performance of casualness that cost him something every single time he had to perform it. Brian May has never described noticing any particular strain in Freddie during this period. This is, in itself, the entire point. Whatever it cost Freddie to be there, he made certain it cost Brian nothing to host him. The 3 weeks were not idle. This is important to understand, because the image of someone sleeping on a friend's floor easily becomes an image of stalled, suspended time, waiting for something to improve. Doing nothing in the meantime, that was not what happened. During the days, Freddie continued working the stall in Kensington Market with Roger Taylor, selling second-hand clothes to a clientele increasingly drawn by the specific theatrical flair both of them brought to retail that had no particular reason to be theatrical. In the evenings, the conversations about a band continued what it would sound like, what it would be called. Whether the singer they had access to, this art student who slept oddly and dressed flamboyantly and sang with an intensity that startled people who had only just met him, was actually going to work out as the right voice for what they were trying to build. Freddie, on Brian's floor each night, was simultaneously homeless in the most literal sense and actively constructing, in real time, the beginning of the only home he would ever fully need, the band that would eventually be called Queen. Brian May, by his own later account, though this account belongs entirely to the dramatized version of events being told here, rather than any verified record, never once asked Freddie directly how serious the situation actually was. He did not ask whether Freddie had savings somewhere he wasn't accessing. He did not ask whether his family, his parents, recently arrived in England themselves, building their own precarious stability, and felt them might be able to help. He did not ask when, exactly, the floor arrangement might end. This was not indifference. It was, in its way, a specific kind of respect, the recognition that Freddie had asked for exactly one thing: a place to sleep, and that asking for more information than that would have required Freddie to admit to a vulnerability he had very deliberately not put into words. Brian May gave him the floor and the silence around the floor. Both were, it would turn out decades later, gifts of roughly equal size. Both were, it would turn out decades later, gifts of roughly equal size. What Freddie needed in February 1970 was not actually solved by a floor to sleep on. A floor does not pay rent on a flat that no longer exists. A floor does not generate the income that the clothing stall and the scattered illustration work were not. That winter, quite managing to generate fast enough. What the floor solved was smaller and, in its way, larger than the practical problem. It solved the question of where his body went each night, which meant it solved, by extension, the question of whether he had to explain his situation to anyone outside the room he was standing in. Brian May's flat became, for 3 weeks, the only place in London where Freddie Mercury did not have to perform, having a solution to a problem he had not yet found one for. That is what the silence was worth. That is, perhaps, why it mattered enough to remember for 21 years. The 3 weeks ended, as these things usually do, undramatically. Freddie found another arrangement, a different flat. A different combination of flatmates, some shift in the clothing stall's fortunes that made the immediate crisis pass. He thanked Brian, in whatever brief and characteristically deflecting way he handled gratitude even then, rolled up the sleeping bag one final time, and left to go build the rest of his life from a slightly more stable floor than the one he had just spent 3 weeks on. The band continued assembling itself around both of them, regardless Roger Taylor's drumming, Brian May's guitar, the searching, still uncertain question of what to call themselves, and who exactly Freddie Bulsara was going to become now that Farrick had quietly receded and something else was emerging in its place. Nobody at the time treated the 3 weeks as significant. It was simply what happened between two people who had not yet become anything to each other beyond bandmates in progress, sorting out a temporary problem the way young people without much money are constantly required to. 21 years later, in a bedroom in Kensington, in the final weeks of his life, Freddie Mercury brought up the 3 weeks himself. Nobody had asked. It was not, by any account, a subject that had come up between the two of them in the intervening decades, not during the Bohemian Rhapsody sessions, not during Live Aid, not during any of the thousands of hours the two men had spent together since, building one of the most successful creative partnerships in the history of popular music, but in the bedroom, near the end, with the curtains drawn against the cameras outside, and the conversation moving in the unhurried associative way that conversations move when there is finally nothing left to manage or perform. Freddie brought it up. He said, "Do you remember the floor?" Brian said he did. And then Freddie told him, for the first time in 21 years, what those 3 weeks had actually felt like from the inside, not the version where it was a minor manageable inconvenience, but the real version, the one he had spent 2 decades making sure nobody saw, the real version, the one he had spent 2 decades making sure nobody saw. What Freddie described, according to the version of this story being told here, was not really about the floor itself. It was about the specific terror of those 3 weeks, the terror of being 23 years old in a city that did not know his name yet, with a voice he was not certain anyone would ever pay to hear, sleeping on borrowed floor space and rolling up the evidence of it every morning so that even the one person generous enough to offer the floor would not have to see how frightened he actually was. He told Brian that every morning during those 3 weeks, before he rolled up the sleeping bag, he had lain there for a few minutes, convincing himself that the version of his life he wanted, the music, the stage, the name that did not exist yet, was still possible. Because some mornings, lying on a friend's floor, with no money and no flat and no certainty that any of it would work, it had not felt possible at all. Brian May has never, in any account connected to this dramatized story, fully explained why Freddie waited until he was dying to say this. But the explanation does not require much speculation, because it is consistent with everything else known about how Freddie Mercury managed difficulty across his entire life. He did not perform vulnerability while there was still time for that vulnerability to be used against him by the press, by competitors, by anyone who might decide that the most famous rock singer in the world had once been frightened and homeless and uncertain whether his voice would ever matter to anyone. He kept the real version of the 3 weeks exactly as private as he had kept it in 1970. For the same reasons, for as long as those reasons remained relevant. And then, dying, with nothing left to protect and no career left to manage, the reasons stopped applying, and the truth became something he could finally hand to the one person who had actually been there for it. 21 years too late to change anything about how it had felt, but not too late to be known. What Brian May did with this confession in the years since is exactly what he has done with so much of what Freddie left him. He kept it not publicly described, not turned into an anecdote for interviews, not converted into the kind of content that the rest of Freddie Mercury's life has almost entirely eventually become. It exists, in the version of this story being told, as one more thing Brian May carries privately about a friendship that began, of all the unglamorous ways a friendship can begin, with an unemployed art school graduate asking to sleep on his floor for what both of them assumed, at the time, would be a few days at most. 3 weeks. 21 years of silence about what those 3 weeks actually felt like. And then, at the very end, the truth, not because the truth would change anything, but because some debts, even unspoken ones, even ones the other person never knew existed, apparently still need to be paid before the account closes for good. Some debts, even unspoken ones, even ones the other person never knew existed, apparently still need to be paid before the account closes for good. This is perhaps the simplest way to understand what passed between two men in a Kensington bedroom near the end of one of their lives. Not a confession in the dramatic sense. Not an admission of failure or weakness presented for absolution. Simply an accounting, the quiet correction of a record that only one of the two people involved had ever known was incomplete. Brian May had always believed the 3 weeks were what they appeared to be. A minor, temporary inconvenience between two young men still working out who they were going to become. Freddie, dying, gave him the real version instead. Not because he needed to. Because, at the very end, with everything else already settled or already lost, it seemed worth making sure that at least one person in the world knew what those mornings on the floor had actually been. 1970. A flat in West London. 23 years old. No money. No flat of his own. No name that meant anything yet. A sleeping bag rolled tight each morning. 3 weeks on Brian May's floor. Nobody asked why. Nobody explained. The band kept assembling itself around both of them anyway. Years passed. Decades. Bohemian Rhapsody. Live Aid. Everything the world now knows. And then, near the end, in a quiet bedroom, do you remember the floor? Brian said he did. And Freddie told him, finally, what it had actually felt like. The fear. The mornings spent convincing himself it was still possible. The performance of casualness that cost him something every single time. 21 years of silence paid off in one conversation. Brian May has kept it private, since some things are not told to be believed. They are told simply to be known. Once, by the one person who was already there.